The morning sun bathed the quiet suburban neighborhood in a golden glow, illuminating perfectly manicured lawns, white picket fences, and rows of nearly identical houses. It was the kind of place where nothing seemed out of the ordinary, where every neighbor waved as they walked their dogs, every car parked neatly in driveways, and every child played in backyards under the watchful eyes of protective parents. Among these watchful eyes was Mrs. Clara Henderson, a middle-aged woman with salt and pepper hair neatly tied back in a bun. Clara had lived in the neighborhood for over 2 decades, a self-proclaimed steward of order and harmony. From her bay window she could see the entire street, a vantage point she often used to keep things in check. Today was no different. With a cup of steaming tea in one hand and her phone in the other, Clara stood at her window, scanning the neighborhood as she often did. Children were riding their bikes, the mailman was making his rounds, and a jogger was huffing past with his golden retriever in tow. Everything seemed just as it should. That was when Clara noticed him. A young black teen walked casually into view, a backpack slung over one shoulder. He was dressed in jeans and a plain hoodie, his headphones around his neck hinting at his age. His steps were unhurried, almost as if he were exploring or looking for something. Clara's brows furrowed slightly. She hadn't seen this boy before, and in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, he stood out. Who could he be? She muttered to herself, her tea momentarily forgotten. She watched as the boy paused near one of the houses, pulling out his phone and glancing at the screen. To Clara it looked suspicious, too suspicious. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was he texting someone? Taking pictures? Planning something? The boy adjusted his backpack and continued walking, but Clara's eyes didn't leave him. She felt a growing unease, an instinct that told her something wasn't right. In her mind, Clara began piecing together a narrative. Maybe he's not from around here, she thought. What if he's scoping out houses? She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought, but her gaze remained locked on the boy. The teen stopped again, this time near a different house, and looked down at his phone once more. Clara felt her chest tighten. "That's the Jeffersons' place," she murmured. "They're not home this morning." She quickly set her tea down and grabbed her phone. Her finger hovered over the screen as she hesitated, second-guessing her instincts. Maybe he's harmless, she thought, but the unease wouldn't go away. What if she didn't act and something happened? What if he was up to no good? The questions gnawed at her, pushing her toward action. Clara pressed the emergency number and brought the phone to her ear. 911, what's your emergency? A calm voice answered. Clara took a deep breath. "Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious individual in my neighborhood," she began, her tone firm but laced with concern. "He's a young man, maybe in his teens, and he's walking around the houses, looking at his phone. I've never seen him before." The dispatcher asked a few clarifying questions, which Clara answered with precision, glancing back out the window to provide updates. "He's near the Jeffersons' place now. Yes, he's carrying a backpack. I think he might be scouting the area." The dispatcher assured her that officers would be dispatched promptly, and Clara hung up, a mix of relief and apprehension washing over her. From her window she continued to watch the boy. He was now standing at the edge of the sidewalk, seemingly unaware of the commotion he had unknowingly stirred. Clara folded her arms, her thoughts a whirlwind. She had done what she believed was right, hadn't she? Protecting the neighborhood was everyone's responsibility after all, but a small, nagging voice in the back of her mind questioned whether she had acted too quickly, whether she had let her assumptions cloud her judgment. But there was no turning back now. The police were on their way. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the stillness of the suburban morning. Clara Henderson stood at her window, her gaze fixed on the black teen as he lingered near the Jeffersons' front yard. Her heart raced, not out of fear, but out of a strange mix of self-assuredness and unease. She had done the right thing, hadn't she? It was her duty to protect the neighborhood. The boy, oblivious to the growing commotion, stood by the sidewalk scrolling through his phone. A patrol car turned the corner, its flashing lights reflecting off the manicured lawns. Clara stepped onto her porch, clutching her phone tightly as if it validated her actions. The police car rolled to a stop. 2 officers stepped out, their movements brisk and practiced. The taller of the 2, Officer Martinez, scanned the area, while his partner, Officer Green, adjusted the radio on his shoulder. Both officers exuded authority, their presence immediately altering the energy of the street. "Ma'am," Officer Martinez called out as he approached Clara. "You're the one who made the call?" Clara nodded quickly, gesturing toward the teen. "Yes, officer. He's the one I told you about. I've never seen him around here before, and he's been walking up and down the street, stopping near houses." Her voice carried a mix of urgency and righteousness, as if she were already certain of the boy's guilt. Officer Green followed her gaze, his eyes landing on the teen. "All right, we'll handle it. Please stay here." Clara nodded again, folding her arms as she watched the officers approach the boy. The teen, noticing the police now, lowered his phone and looked up. His posture stiffened slightly, his expression shifting from casual to wary. "Excuse me, young man," Officer Martinez said, his tone firm but measured. "Can we talk to you for a moment?" The teen frowned but nodded. "Sure," he replied, his voice calm but cautious. "What's this about?" the teen asked, his hands loosely at his sides, showing no signs of hostility. Officer Green took a step closer. "We got a call about someone acting suspiciously in this area. Can you tell us what you're doing here?" The teen blinked, his confusion evident. "Suspicious? I'm just walking through. I was checking my phone for directions." "Do you live around here?" Martinez asked, his tone still professional but probing. "No, I don't," the teen answered honestly, holding their gaze. "I'm visiting. I was looking for a specific house." Clara, still watching from her porch, couldn't help but interject. "He's been pacing up and down the street," she said loudly, stepping forward. "Stopping near houses. It didn't look right." The officers glanced at her briefly before turning back to the teen. "Do you have any ID on you?" Officer Green asked. The teen hesitated for a moment before reaching into his pocket. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he were keenly aware of the tension. He pulled out his wallet and handed over a school ID card. Martinez examined it, his brows furrowing slightly as he read the name. "Darren Cooper," he said aloud. "And where exactly are you headed, Darren?" "I'm looking for my tutor's house," Darren explained, his voice steady. "He lives here. I just didn't know the exact address, so I stopped to check my phone." From her spot on the porch, Clara folded her arms tighter. "I've lived here for over 20 years, she said, her voice cutting through the conversation. "I know everyone who comes and goes, and I've never seen him before." Darren glanced at her briefly, his expression unreadable, before turning back to the officers. "I don't think knowing everyone is a requirement for walking through a neighborhood," he said calmly. Clara's jaw tightened at his response. "I'm just saying, it's unusual, especially with everything happening these days." Her voice trailed off, leaving her insinuation hanging in the air. A few houses down, neighbors began to peek from their windows or linger on their porches, drawn by the flashing lights and rising tension. Some whispered quietly to each other, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. "All right, Darren," Officer Martinez said, handing back the ID. "You said you're looking for your tutor's house. Do you have any way to confirm that?" Darren nodded and pulled out his phone, scrolling to a text message thread. He held the phone out for the officers to see. "This is him. He sent me the address, but I guess I took a wrong turn." Officer Green leaned in to read the message, his expression softening slightly. "That matches the address at the end of the street," he said to Martinez. Clara's face reddened slightly, but she pressed on. Still, you have to admit, it looks suspicious. A young man like him, walking around like that. Like what, ma'am? Darren interrupted, his tone polite but firm. His question hung in the air, unanswered. The officers exchanged a glance. Officer Martinez turned to Clara. Ma'am, we'll confirm his story, but so far we haven't found anything to indicate he's doing anything wrong. Clara's lips tightened, and for the first time she seemed to falter. I just thought. Her voice trailed off as Darren met her gaze, his calm eyes holding hers for a moment longer than she expected. It wasn't anger or defiance she saw. It was disappointment. The quiet murmurs of the other neighbors grew louder as the officers stepped aside to discuss next steps. Darren stood patiently, his shoulders relaxed, but his expression resolute. Clara retreated slightly, her confidence beginning to crumble. The morning sun was now higher in the sky, casting a sharper light on the scene unfolding in the quiet suburban street. The two officers stood near Darren, their postures rigid yet professional, while Clara Henderson lingered on the edge, her confidence rising once more. She folded her arms tightly across her chest, watching Darren like a hawk. I just don't understand why he's here, Clara said, stepping closer to the officers, her voice sharp. He says he's looking for a tutor, but does he look like a kid who'd need one? And why can't he just find the address properly? It doesn't make sense. Officer Green raised an eyebrow but kept his tone neutral. Ma'am, we're working on verifying his story. Clara waved her hand dismissively. I've seen enough true crime documentaries to know when someone is making excuses. He's just trying to stall for time. Darren, standing a few feet away, glanced at her briefly, his expression unreadable. He clasped his hands together in front of him, a gesture of patience rather than defensiveness. I've already explained why I'm here, he said, his voice calm. If there's anything else you need, feel free to ask. But Clara wasn't satisfied. Oh, I'm sure you've got an explanation for everything, she shot back. People always do until the truth comes out. Darren inhaled deeply, keeping his composure. He looked directly at the officers. Look, I understand why you're here. I don't blame you for following up on a call, but I've answered your questions. I showed you my ID, and I even gave you the address I'm looking for. So, respectfully, what else do you need from me? Officer Martinez hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing Darren's words. The teen's composure was disarming, even admirable, but the neighbor's persistent accusations hung heavily in the air. We just need to confirm your story, Martinez replied, his tone softer now. If everything checks out, you're free to go. That's fine, Darren said simply, nodding. Take your time. Clara scoffed audibly. Take your time? Really? I've never seen someone so relaxed under these circumstances. Doesn't that seem odd to you, officers? Most people would be nervous. Darren turned to her then, his gaze steady and unwavering. I have nothing to be nervous about, he said quietly. The weight of his words seemed to hang in the air, silencing her for a moment. Clara opened her mouth to respond, but for once no words came. As the officers stepped aside to make a call, Clara seized the moment to approach Darren directly. She stopped a few feet from him, her expression tight with frustration. You know, I've lived here for 20 years, she began, her voice low but pointed. I know when something's off. And you? You're out of place here. Darren tilted his head slightly, his calm demeanor unshaken. Out of place? He repeated. What does that mean exactly? It means, Clara said, her tone sharpening, you don't belong here. This is a safe neighborhood. We don't have random people wandering around pretending they're lost. Darren smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. I didn't realize walking while black was considered suspicious, he said, his voice even. Clara's face reddened, but she quickly masked her discomfort with indignation. Don't twist my words, she snapped. This has nothing to do with that. It's about behavior. Yours just doesn't add up. Officer Green returned, holding his radio in one hand. "We've confirmed the address," he said to Darren. "It matches what you showed us." Darren nodded. "Great. Can I head there now?" Before the officers could respond, Clara interjected again. "Wait a minute. Just because the address matches doesn't mean his story does. How do we know he's not planning something? People like him always have a backup plan." "People like me?" Darren asked, his voice soft but cutting through the noise. Clara hesitated, realizing too late what she had said. "You know what I mean," she muttered, looking away. "No, I don't," Darren replied. "Maybe you can explain." The street had grown eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of a lawnmower a few houses down. The neighbors who had been watching from their porches now seemed frozen, their expressions ranging from discomfort to disbelief. The silence stretched, heavy with tension. Officer Martinez cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Clara, "we've found no reason to believe Mr. Cooper is doing anything wrong. He's given us all the information we need." Clara's jaw tightened. "But you can't just let him go. What if—" "What if what?" Darren interrupted, his voice firmer now but still controlled. He turned to face her fully, his posture tall and steady. "What if I'm telling the truth? What if I'm just here for the reason I said I was? What if your assumptions are the only thing wrong here?" The words landed heavily, and for the first time, Clara seemed genuinely at a loss. She took a small step back, her confidence visibly wavering. The officers exchanged a glance before Officer Green spoke. "Unless there's anything else, ma'am, we need to let him go." Clara opened her mouth as if to protest, but then stopped herself. The weight of the moment seemed to settle on her, though whether it was guilt or frustration was unclear. As Darren adjusted his backpack and prepared to leave, Clara watched him with a mixture of resentment and unease. "He's too calm," she murmured under her breath, loud enough for a nearby neighbor to hear. The neighbor, an older man with a watering can in hand, shook his head. "Maybe he's calm because he's done nothing wrong," he said quietly, before walking back inside his house. Clara's face burned with embarrassment, but she refused to back down. She stayed rooted to her spot as Darren walked away, the officers trailing a few steps behind. The scene wasn't over yet, but something inside her already felt defeated. The tension in the air was palpable, a quiet storm brewing in the small suburban street. Darren adjusted his backpack once more, glancing briefly at the two officers. Though his face remained composed, there was a flicker of weariness in his eyes. The back and forth, the suspicion, the veiled accusations, it was a routine he had come to expect, but not one he had ever grown used to. Clara Henderson, still standing a few feet away, couldn't suppress her glare. Her mind raced with justifications for her actions. Surely there was more to this boy than he let on, she thought. The officers, too, seemed conflicted. Officer Martinez shifted on his feet, while Officer Green glanced at Darren's phone again, as if searching for something definitive. Darren reached into his backpack, his movements slow and deliberate. "I think I can clear this up," he said evenly, pulling out a slim folder. The officers watched closely, their professional demeanor masking their curiosity. Clara, however, took a step forward, her suspicion flaring once more. "What's that?" she demanded, her voice sharp. Darren held up the folder, meeting her gaze calmly. "My acceptance letter." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. "Acceptance letter?" Officer Green repeated, furrowing his brow. Darren nodded. "To Harvard. I'm heading there in the fall." Opening the folder, Darren pulled out a crisp sheet of paper emblazoned with the Harvard University crest. He handed it to Officer Martinez, who took it cautiously, his expression unreadable. The officer's eyes scanned the letter, and his brows slowly lifted in surprise. "Congratulations," he said after a moment, his tone softer. Darren shrugged slightly. "Thanks." Officer Green leaned over to glance at the letter, his posture relaxing as he read the official acceptance notice. The words were clear. "Dear Darren Cooper, Congratulations on your admission to Harvard University's incoming class." Clara's jaw slackened as she stared at the paper. For a moment, she seemed frozen, her thoughts racing as she tried to reconcile the young man standing before her with the image she had built in her mind. This can't be," she stammered, her voice faltering. "Harvard? Really?" Darren turned to her, his expression neutral. "Why is that so hard to believe?" Clara's face flushed with embarrassment. She opened her mouth to respond, but couldn't find the words. Her assumptions, so firmly rooted in bias and prejudice, now felt flimsy and exposed. She began, but her voice trailed off. Her gaze shifted to the ground, as if the pristine sidewalk might offer her some form of escape. "Ma'am," Officer Green said gently, breaking the silence, "it looks like Mr. Cooper here has been completely honest. I think we can safely say there's no reason for concern." Clara's head snapped up at the officer's words, but the shame in her eyes remained. I didn't mean—" She stopped herself again, struggling to piece together an apology. Officer Martinez handed the letter back to Darren, his demeanor noticeably softer. "Congratulations on Harvard," he said, his voice tinged with genuine respect. "That's an incredible achievement." "Thank you," Darren replied, his tone polite but restrained. Officer Green nodded. "Sorry for the inconvenience. We were just following up on the call, but it looks like everything checks out." Darren gave a small smile, his posture relaxed, yet dignified. "I get it. You're doing your job." The officers exchanged a glance, their earlier suspicion now replaced by subtle regret. It was clear that Darren's calmness and integrity had made an impression on them. Darren turned back to Clara, who still stood rooted to the spot, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she avoided his gaze. "I hope you understand now," Darren said, his voice steady but kind. "Just because someone doesn't look like they belong doesn't mean they don't." Clara's eyes flicked up to meet his. For the first time she seemed to really see him, not the assumption she had made, but the person standing before her. She started, her voice shaking slightly. "I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. I didn't mean to—" "To what?" Darren interrupted, though his tone was more curious than accusatory. "To judge me? To assume I was dangerous?" Clara's face burned red, and she dropped her gaze again. "I'm sorry," she murmured, the words barely audible. Darren nodded, accepting the apology without lingering on it. "We all make mistakes," he said simply. The officers stepped back, signaling the end of the encounter. "You're free to go, Mr. Cooper," Officer Green said. "Thanks," Darren replied. He adjusted his backpack, the faintest smile on his lips. He glanced once more at Clara, then turned and walked toward the end of the street, his steps measured and deliberate. The silence he left behind was deafening. Clara remained on the curb, her arms now hanging limply at her sides. Around her, a few neighbors peeked from their windows, their faces reflecting a mix of curiosity and quiet judgment. Not at Darren, but at her. As Darren disappeared from view, Clara let out a slow, shaky breath. For the first time in years, she felt small and vulnerable, the weight of her actions pressing heavily on her chest. The quiet street, once bustling with whispers and lingering stares, now seemed subdued, as though even the trees and wind were processing the gravity of what had unfolded. Clara Henderson remained rooted in place, her body stiff and her mind swirling. The words she had just spoken, "I'm sorry," felt heavy yet inadequate. The police officers were preparing to leave, their shift in demeanor clear. They exchanged a few words quietly with one another, their movements slower now, as if they, too, were reflecting on the moment. But Clara's attention was fixed on Darren, who had paused just before turning the corner. His back was to her, but she could feel the weight of his silence, the quiet dignity with which he carried himself. "Wait," Clara called, her voice trembling. She took a step forward, her arms still hanging at her sides. Darren stopped, but didn't turn immediately. When he finally faced her, his expression was calm, almost unreadable. His silence gave her permission to speak, but the words wouldn't come easily. I didn't mean for it to go this far," she began, her voice faltering. Her eyes darted between him and the ground, avoiding his gaze as much as she could. I thought I was doing the right thing." Darren tilted his head slightly, his expression still neutral. He said nothing, letting her continue. "I've lived here for years," she said, her words spilling out faster now. "And I've always been careful, you know? I thought I was protecting the neighborhood." "But from me?" Darren asked softly, his words cutting through her excuses like a blade. Clara flinched, her face turning red. "I didn't know who you were," she stammered. "I didn't know you were—" "Well, you know." "What?" Darren interrupted gently, but his tone carried weight. "You didn't know I was going to Harvard? That I had a potential? Would that have made me less suspicious to you?" Clara's mouth opened and closed, her embarrassment and guilt consuming her. She shook her head weakly. "No, that's not what I meant. I wasn't thinking clearly." Darren raised an eyebrow, his expression softening just slightly. "You were thinking clearly, ma'am," he said. "You just made the wrong assumptions." The statement landed heavily, silencing Clara. She swallowed hard, her hands twisting nervously. "I'm sorry," she said again, this time more firmly. Her voice cracked slightly as she continued. "I really am. I shouldn't have judged you like that." Darren watched her for a long moment, his calm eyes unwavering. Finally, he gave a small nod. "Thank you," he said simply. Darren's response wasn't filled with forgiveness or anger. It was just an acknowledgment, a quiet acceptance of her apology. His grace in the moment stood in stark contrast to Clara's earlier hostility, and it made her regret cut even deeper. She wanted to say more, to explain herself, to somehow undo the harm she had caused, but Darren's calmness told her that no amount of words could erase what had already been done. "I hope you have a good day," Darren said softly, his tone polite but final. He adjusted his backpack and turned again, walking toward the house at the end of the street. Clara watched him go, her heart heavy with shame. The truth was, she wasn't sure she deserved his calmness. As Darren disappeared from view, Clara turned slowly, her gaze falling on the scattered neighbors who had watched everything unfold. A few were still peeking from their windows, while others lingered on their porches. Mrs. Davis, an elderly woman from across the street, shook her head disapprovingly. She leaned on her cane, her sharp eyes fixed on Clara. "What were you thinking, Clara?" she called out, her voice cutting through the stillness. "That boy wasn't doing anything wrong." Clara winced at the words, but before she could respond, Mr. Peterson, a retired teacher, chimed in from his garden. "I've seen that boy before," he said. "He's a good kid, bright, polite. You judged him before you even knew him." Clara's shoulders sagged, the weight of their words pressing down on her. The judgment of her neighbors stung, but what hurt more was knowing they were right. "I thought I was protecting us," she said weakly, but the excuse felt hollow even to her. "No, Clara," Mrs. Davis replied firmly. "You were protecting yourself from your own fears, and you let those fears hurt someone who didn't deserve it." The other neighbors murmured quietly among themselves, their expressions a mix of disappointment and reflection. Clara felt their eyes on her, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like the confident steward of the neighborhood she had always prided herself on being. The officers returned to their car, their movements quieter and more subdued than when they had arrived. Officer Martinez glanced at Clara briefly, his expression neutral but unreadable. As he opened the car door, he paused. "Sometimes," he said, "it's better to think twice before making assumptions. We're all guilty of it, but it can cause a lot of harm." Clara nodded mutely, her throat too tight to speak. She watched as the patrol car pulled away, the flashing lights fading into the distance. Clara stood on her porch long after Darren had gone, her mind replaying the events of the morning. She thought of his calmness, his dignity, his quiet strength in the face of her baseless accusations. She thought of his words, sharp but fair, gentle but firm. Her gaze drifted to the end of the street, where Darren had disappeared. For the first time, Clara saw her neighborhood not as a place she needed to protect, but as a place she had failed. And in that failure, she saw herself. Clara Henderson didn't move from her porch for a long time after Darren had left. The warm sunlight no longer felt comforting, the familiar hum of the neighborhood no longer reassuring. Around her, the quiet disapproval of her neighbors lingered like an invisible weight. She could feel their eyes on her, their judgment as heavy as her own thoughts. Inside, her house felt too big, too quiet. Clara paced the living room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The words Darren had spoken played over in her mind. What if your assumptions are the only thing wrong here? She winced at the memory, each word cutting deeper now than it had in the moment. For years she had prided herself on being a protector of her community, a vigilant neighbor who looked out for others. But today had revealed a different truth, one she couldn't ignore. She hadn't protected anyone. She had hurt someone. By mid-afternoon, Clara found herself walking toward the end of the street where Darren had gone. She wasn't sure what she would say or if he would even want to hear it, but she needed to try. She approached the modest house cautiously, hesitating before knocking on the door. It opened after a moment, and Darren stood there, his expression neutral but polite. He had changed into a different hoodie, and his backpack was now resting on a chair, visible in the hallway behind him. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, his tone calm. Clara swallowed hard, her hands twisting nervously. "Darren, I wanted to talk to you, if you'll let me." Darren stepped aside slightly, gesturing for her to come in. She entered hesitantly, the quiet house feeling like a stark contrast to the morning's chaos. They sat in the small living room, the air between them heavy with unspoken tension. "I owe you an apology," Clara began, her voice trembling slightly. "A real one, not just for this morning, but for everything I assumed about you." Darren nodded, waiting silently for her to continue. "I thought I was protecting the neighborhood," she said, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "But the truth is, I wasn't protecting anyone. I was just reacting, out of fear, out of ignorance." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with genuine regret. "You didn't deserve what I put you through, and I'm sorry for that." Darren leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed, but his expression thoughtful. "I appreciate that," he said simply. "I don't know what else to say," Clara admitted, her voice cracking. "I can't undo what happened, but I can promise you this. I'll do better. I'll think before I act. I'll challenge my own assumptions." Darren gave her a small, faint smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes, but still carried a sense of grace. "That's all anyone can do," he said. Clara hesitated before speaking again. You're a remarkable young man," she said softly. "Harvard should be proud to have you." "Thank you," Darren replied. "But you know, Mrs. Henderson, it shouldn't take a Harvard acceptance letter for someone to be treated with respect." Clara's breath caught, and she nodded slowly, his words hitting her with undeniable truth. "You're right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not about what someone has achieved," Darren continued, his tone even. "It's about who they are, and everyone deserves to be seen for that, not for the assumptions people make about them." As Clara walked back to her house, Darren's words echoed in her mind. She thought about how quickly she had judged him, how easily she had let her biases dictate her actions. It wasn't just about Darren, it was about how she saw the world and how she had allowed fear and prejudice to cloud her perspective. In the quiet of her living room, Clara sat by the window where the morning's events had begun. The view of her neighborhood seemed different now, The houses, the lawns, the people, everything felt more layered, more complex. Judging someone based on appearances reflects more about our own limitations than theirs, Darren had said. And he was right. The story didn't end with Darren's calm acceptance or Clara's apology. It was a beginning, a chance to change, to do better. Clara knew that one conversation couldn't undo years of bias, but it could spark something new. She hoped it could spark the same in others. Challenge your assumptions, she thought. See the person, not the stereotype. As the sun began to set, Clara looked out at the street again. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a protector. She felt like a student, ready to learn,